Welcome, everybody. You coming in, you going, you coming in? You might come, you might come. Welcome, everybody, to our annual Ainsworth lecture. For those of you all who I don't know or who may not know me, I'm Madeline Landrew. I serve as the Dean of the Law School. It's really our great honor every year to host this lecture series. Judge Ainsworth is one of our most distinguished alums, having been appointed by President Kennedy to the United States District Court for the Eastern District here in New Orleans, right downtown, and then by President Lyndon Johnson to the United States Court of Appeals for the Fifth Circuit, when the Fifth Circuit was in its infancy. His mark on history is remarkable, not only in the work that he did through his jurisprudence and through his governance, but also in the legacy that he left behind. And we're honored here to have his daughter, Liz Ainsworth. Ms. Ainsworth is sitting up here in the front row. She is, in fact, the mother of 9 children, and her 9 children and my mother's 9 children grew up together, and they've been friends since their early days. So we grew up with the Rareshide family, and it's such an honor to have her here and her son, John, and their family friend, Ava Denton. Thank you all so much for honoring us by being here. Past Ainsworth lecture speakers have been really some of the extraordinary legal scholars of our time. Judge Higginbotham of the Court of Appeals, Henry Kissinger, who served as the former Secretary of State. Ruth Bader Ginsburg was our Ainsworth lecture speaker one year. And she said this during her speech of Judge Ainsworth, that Judge Ainsworth merits a place in history, first as a state senator and who resisted blatant segregationist bills, then as a wise and good judge whose moderate, consistent, and forward-looking views helped keep the Fifth Circuit steady during the tumultuous times of the 1960s. She then said, "It is altogether fitting that his friends and colleagues have chosen to remember him by founding and maintaining the Ainsworth Memorial Lecture Series at his alma mater." And indeed, it was his law clerks who founded this fund so that we could forever, in perpetuity, honor Judge Ainsworth with lecturers like our guest tonight, James Forman. So before I introduce James Forman, I want you to give a round of applause for the committee, Professor Tchinda, and the committee who put this together. And please give a warm welcome. Now you can stand up. And then a warm welcome to Professor Will Snowden, who's going to introduce our speaker. Professor Snowden.
I said, wait a minute, I thought I was introducing Professor Forman.
You are.
Many of you know that in New Orleans, we call our criminal legal system colloquially as Tulane and Broad. And we often refer to it as that because those are the names of the streets that intersect where the courthouse is, where the public defender's office is. Not too far from there is the DA's office. We got the police headquarters, municipal court, and not too far is the jail. What many of you don't know is that Professor Forman has had a tremendous amount of influence on this intersection. One example of the influence he's been able to have is one of his former students from when he was teaching at Georgetown is now the chief public defender, Danny Engelberg, representing more than 85% of the people that come through that particular courthouse. Something else that you might not know in terms of the influence that Professor Forman has had on this intersection of Tulane and Broad in our criminal legal system is that when he was no longer a public defender after 6 years in DC, he started a school called the Maya Angelou Public Charter High School in Washington, DC. This high school has a sister school called Travis Hill, which is the high school which is in our jail. So a school that he started in DC has a sister school here in our city with a very similar purpose, to serve people in our jail to get a high school degree. In DC, I believe it's serving young people who have had contact with the criminal legal system or might be on probation or other types of supervision. The third kind of influence that he has had or connection to New Orleans is something that is actually personal to me. Before going to law school, I was an investigator. I represented a woman by the name of Wakita Coleman, and she ended up serving 10 years in prison. Professor Forman has a program that's called the Inside Out program, which takes students from Yale, matches him up with students in prison. And Wakita Coleman was one of the first students in Professor Forman's in and out program at the correctional facility in Danbury, Connecticut. As teachers, as public defenders, one of the most flattering things that we can get in this profession is to hear about our students being successful or to see our clients being successful. And I had the privilege of texting with Wakita Coleman today. Professor Forman, you may know her as New York because that's what they called her. And one of the times in the class, Professor Forman called on Wakita, and her answer was money, power, and respect. I don't know what the question was, but that was her answer. I asked Wakita, how would you describe Professor Forman in 3 words? She said, I would describe him as a humanitarian, a force to be reckoned with, and a very nice person. She wanted me to tell you that she's doing exactly what you told her to do, which was be successful, get a job, and work hard. She is currently an employment specialist at the Fortune Society in New York City. Please take your left hand and put it in the air. Take your right hand and put it in the air. Put those hands together and welcome Professor Forman.
That might have been the most meaningful. Thank you, Professor Snowden, and I did not know about that connection, and so I'm still. The only thing is, you made me a little emotional, you know, at the start of the talk, but I really do appreciate that, and I appreciate Dean Landrew, I appreciate Professor Tuchinda, I appreciate the family of Judge Ainsworth. I appreciate all of y'all for coming out. I know how busy life is as a law student, so the fact that y'all came here, even whether you came here for Professor Snowden's extra credit or otherwise, I am glad you are here. I thought I would tell you a little bit before I get into the title of my talk, 3 Keys to Dismantling Mass Incarceration. I thought I would tell you a little bit about the journey that brings me to this conversation with you tonight. In 2017, I wrote a book called Locking Up Our Own. And that book looks at the history of America's criminal system through the lens of black communities in particular. So through the lens of black judges and black prosecutors, black decision makers, black legislators, black police chiefs, and black activists and black citizens. And it's a book about the criminal justice system that we've created in this country. It's a book about how we got here to today. And when I was asked to speak about it, you know, in the years after the book came out, I spent a couple of years talking at universities, at bookstores, at libraries, at community centers. And like most authors, I was happy to go anywhere that folks would listen. And I would talk about how America still incarcerates more than any other country in the world, how we target black people disproportionately, how we target poor people disproportionately of all races, how we jail hundreds of thousands of people only because they're too poor to post money bail, how we imprison in conditions of solitary confinement that the UN considers torture. How once a person is released from home, instead of welcoming them back into the community, we exclude them, we stigmatize them, we make it difficult for them to get a job and find a place to live. And I would talk about how all this policing and punishment requires an enormous and expensive bureaucracy. And everywhere I went after I gave one of those talks, one of the most common questions that I got was, well, what can we do about it? And after a while, I started bringing more of that material into the talk. I started telling people about things that you've heard. Some of you all know Professor Snowden talks about with the Jury Project. I started talking to people about what an individual as a juror can do and the difference you can make. No matter how much material I included about what people can do, audience members still asked for more. They still wanted to know more. always one of the first questions was, what can we do? What can I do? Eventually, as a writer, when people keep asking you the same question, you realize that there's interest in a topic. And when you don't have a good answer yourself, it makes you want to develop one. And so I wanted, in all of those talks, I wanted to have a book that I could give people that was a compilation of examples of things that people could do and that people were doing. And so that's where my new book, Dismantling Mass Incarceration, A Handbook for Change, comes into the picture. Write this book, my co-authors, who you see pictured here, Premal Daria, Maria Huilo, also former public defenders like myself. We spent 3 years reviewing the literature on the criminal legal system. We talked to experts. We debated with friends. We debated with each other. And all of these conversations had a single goal. We wanted to bring together in one place, in one set of pages, some of the most useful, compelling, provocative writing on how to dismantle mass incarceration. Now, our task in some ways turned out to be harder than we expected because there's been an outpouring of writing about mass incarceration in the last decade, but a lot of it is like my book. A lot of it is devoted to the problem, how we got here, not so much to possible solutions and what to do about it. But we did eventually find some wonderful material, including an excerpt from your own Professor Snowden, and we supplemented it with our own writing, introducing the book as a whole, as well as each chapter, with analysis to guide you through the various kinds of interventions. The book contains a number of examples of what I'll be talking about today, examples of people fighting for change, people trying to resist the criminal system and its overreach. The stories in the book inspire me, and I hope that they do so for you as well. Now, I'm not going to try to summarize a whole book in one talk, but for those of you who do want the whole thing, I have good news for you, which is after the talk, I'll be doing a book signing, and I want to say 2 things about that. First of all, there's a fantastic bookseller, Baldwin and Company, and I hope that those of you here support your local independent bookstores. We need independent bookstores, especially ones that have a commitment to the community. So I hope you'll visit their store as well. And also for tonight, I'm going to keep a tradition that I started back in 2017 when my first book came out. I remember well before 2017, I remember being a student. I was on scholarship. And I remember as a student never having enough. And I remember going to a book talk in college and wanting to buy a book. It was by Nikki Giovanni, who came and spoke. But I didn't have the funds. And I never wanted anyone to feel that way at one of my events. So what I want everybody to know is that we operate tonight on a pay-what-you-can basis. If you can pay the list price, fabulous, go for it. If it's something less than that, fabulous, go for it. And if your currency that you have tonight is your smile and your commitment to read, that's great. Then that's the currency that we'll accept. And so I hope you'll come get a book and come have it signed and come talk to me. So in my remarks, I want to draw on some lessons from the book to offer what I want to suggest are 3 keys to dismantling mass incarceration. For those of you that notice the poster out there, you may notice that it says 5 keys, and then the PowerPoint says 3 keys. As I was working on my remarks, I realized I could distill 5 down to 3, and it's always good to have a smaller number, so I decided to go with that. And the first one that I want to propose is this idea that each of you sitting in this room, needs to claim your power. We each need to claim our power. So I was originally introduced to this concept as a child from my parents. My parents are photographed here. They're civil rights activists. And they met a couple of years before these pictures were taken. They met in SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. They were an interracial couple at a time when those marriages were illegal in many states in this country. Loving versus Virginia had not yet been decided when they met. And they taught me about this idea of claiming my power from a young age. Now, you might think, especially by looking at that picture of my dad being arrested, you might think, well, they taught me this idea by marching and protesting and getting arrested and things like that. And they did. But here I'm really talking about the more mundane ways, but as important ways that parents pass along messages to their children. I remember I was in high school, and there's a lot of great things about being a child of civil rights activists, but educational and housing stability is not on that list. So we moved a lot. We went to 10, I was in 10th grade, I had gone to 10 schools. And I was at a new school, almost by definition. And at this high school, it was the second or third day, I was still learning my way around. I was in the bathroom, and I saw some kids kind of bullying another kid. And I would not have used these terms then. I did not have the language to describe it at that point. But they were making fun of this kid for his emerging or evolving gender identity. And I didn't have the words, but I knew that it was wrong. And I remember I went home and I was talking to my mom, and I was talking to her about, how wrong this was, what I had seen. And my mom was one of those, I don't know if any of y'all students had a parent like this, or if any of y'all parents are like this. But my mom was one of those parents that was like always up in the school. Like she was up in the school when I didn't want her to be, complaining about something, arguing about something. She like took the activism a little bit too far. And I never liked that, as you can see. But I was like, okay, Mom, you know how I'm always mad about how you're up at the school about everything? Well, this is actually something where I would invite you to be up there, because I had ideas for what the principal could do, what the assistant principal could do, what my mom could do in response to what I was seeing. And my mom listened to all that, and she's like, I'm glad that you're empathetic, I'm glad that you care, and I'm glad that you have ideas about what can be done. She was like, but I just have one question for you. I was like, what's that? She said, well, what are you going to do? And that idea, right, what are you going to do, is something that I have carried with me since that day, throughout my childhood, into my adulthood. And as I got older, I started to see more examples of my mother's idea. I recently had the chance to speak to somebody who's an expert in organizational change. She goes around the country. She works with businesses and nonprofits, large and small, who are seeking to become more effective in their work. And one of the mantras in her field is the 15% rule. So when she sits down with teams of people, she spends the first hour or so talking about the challenges that the team faces, that the company faces, that the division faces. What's not working? Right? Everyone, she says, is very, very good at answering that question. Long list of things that are not working. And next, they turn to ideas for improvement. Right? What could be done to make it better? How could the team get better? How could the organization be better? Now, people aren't as good at that as they are at the first one, but they're still pretty good. They still have a lot of ideas. And then she turns to the last question. She tells everybody in the room that now is the time for them to think about what part of the improvement they want to take responsibility for. Nobody can do it all, but each person, she says, can take 15%. That's recognizing and claiming our power. Now, people aren't so good at this. In my work today, whenever I'm working with groups and when I'm working with students, wherever I am, I always am working on the 15% rule. Actors in the criminal system are not good at this. I have been asked to speak to groups of judges and I will present them with evidence of harsh sentencing, of unnecessarily long sentences in their jurisdiction. And almost at every time, I watch them, they listen, they process the data, they nod, they're sympathetic, and then the lament begins. If only prosecutors would change how they charge the cases in our jurisdiction, then we wouldn't have to give out such long sentences. So then I go and I get asked to meet with groups of prosecutors. I talk to them about the racial disparities in incarceration rates in their jurisdiction. And then, they'll acknowledge the issue before they say, yes, yes. But the real problem is with the police and who they choose to arrest. Then I get invited to speak to police departments to talk about racial disparities over surveillance of black teens. And they look, they nod, and they're sympathetic. They can't argue with the numbers. They're right up there on the screen. And they say, yes, yes, something needs to be done. Parents need to do a better job of raising their children. So y'all see what's going on, right? And my response is always the 15% rule. I say, yes, the problem is not all yours to solve. Absolutely not. There's other people involved. But since we're all here together in the room, let's talk about your piece. Let's talk about your 15%. And so I think we all need to hold ourselves to that standard, especially when it's challenging, especially when it's uncomfortable. Okay, so how do you find your 15%? Right? How do you find your piece of the work? You're going to claim your power. You're like, I'm not going to put this off on everyone else. But you still got to figure out where you fit in. Right? What's the piece of the work that you want to take as yours? And in a way, our criminal system makes that especially hard. Right? Because we talk about it as a criminal system. Right? People used to say a criminal justice system. And then people challenge that and they say, well, there's no justice, so let's call it a criminal legal system. But either way, we still keep talking about it as a system. Right? That word hasn't changed. But actually, in so many ways, it's not a system in a meaningful sense of that word. Right? People who are concerned about mass incarceration often say, well, if I want to make a difference, where should I focus? Where should I start? And I want to be able to tell everybody the same thing, the president, the governor, the chief of police, the head prosecutor. Right? But of course, in our system, police make arrests, pretrial services recommend bond, prosecutors make charging decisions, defense lawyers defend, judges adjudicate in those cases that don't plead guilty, legislators set a sentencing range, judges impose sentences within that range, corrections departments run prisons, probation and parole supervise people after prison, and so on and so on. So understanding that there are all of these pieces, right, can be frustrating. But that reality, I think, also presents an opening. Because our system is so wrong and so harmful in so many ways, it offers innumerable opportunities to make a difference. Now, there's one other obstacle then that we have to overcome in making this transition once we've decided to claim our power. And it's connected to my second key that I want to talk about. Because one of the problems that we really have to overcome is the enormous constraints that history and practice and ideology and culture and politics, the constraints that have been placed on our collective imaginations. There are many problems with living in a country that has relied on police and prosecution and prisons for as long as this one has. But one of the biggest is the way it's diminished our sense of possibility. So when crime goes up, or when people think it's gone up, because sometimes people get convinced that crime is rising when it isn't, but we then turn to a set of responses that we've come to know, that are familiar. that we've invested in. It's the only set that we know. Now, I could give you a million examples of this phenomenon, but I'm just going to pick one. So, in the city where I live, New Haven, there's been a rise in car thefts by teenagers. Now, New Haven is an overwhelmingly Democratic city. Our mayor is what you would call a liberal. But when pressed about what to do about the rise in car thefts by teenagers, he said, well, the state needs to build more juvenile detention facilities. Why do we need more juvenile detention facilities? Well, here's what he said. He said they would give young people an opportunity to cool down while providing them with resources and support and mentorship. Now, there's nothing wrong. There's a lot right, in fact, with resources and support and mentorship. But we don't need prisons to provide those things. We need to offer them in schools, in neighborhoods, in communities, in rec centers, and boys and girls clubs. So we now have 30 years of research that shows that locking up kids is the worst possible way to provide those resources. So here's one example of what I'm talking about when I say we have 30 years of research. So a few years ago, two economists, Anna Ainsworth and Joseph Doyle, they published a paper that tracked young people in Chicago. And they followed kids from juvenile court to see whether they graduated from high school or were arrested as adults. So they tracked them over time. Now, the paper is persuasive, including to economists with high standards for these things, because it uses random assignment, right? The gold standard in the field for measuring impact. So Chicago's courts randomly assigned teenagers to judges. And so that let these economists take two similarly situated kids, alike in all respects, similar race, similar criminal history, similar charges. The only difference was that one kid was assigned to a tough judge who locked up a lot of kids, and another was assigned to a lenient judge who didn't lock up very many kids. And then they could do that same thing with thousands of teenagers to make it methodologically sound. Now, the young people in their study were only locked up for 42 days. So they were not locked up for a long time. These were not life sentences that were being given out, right? 42 days. And the economists, Ainsworth and Doyle, they weren't sure how it was going to work out. Because maybe a short time in juvenile prison, right, what the mayor was saying, maybe it would send a message. Maybe it would give the teenager a chance to go on the right path, to have a timeout. But they found the opposite. So the kids who were locked up, again, otherwise identical, did worse. They were, over time, 40% less likely to graduate from high school and 23% more likely to be incarcerated as adults. Now, there's a dozen similar studies. So here's the question. Why is my mayor and so many like him still talking about locking kids up as if it will help them? Right? And I'm not picking on him. In fact, one of the reasons I use the example of the mayor of New Haven is that he is profoundly decent. I know him personally. And that's not like New Haven is small. So like everyone knows, we all know the mayor. He's not a politician who's trying to scare and demonize kids, right? Who's trying to scare people on crime. He's a liberal, but he has bought into this idea, this collective idea that we have bought into in this country, which is that when you are faced with a real problem, and the rise in car thefts is a real problem, it's not made up, it's a real problem, but when you are faced with that, you turn, in the first instance, to more prison. Why does he do that? I would say it's because, like so many Americans, his imagination is constrained. It's constrained by history, it's constrained by what he knows, it's constrained by what he's done before. And so that means if we're going to follow a different path, we have to resist those constraints. We have to be willing to try things that we haven't tried before. We have to use this second key, which is expanding our imaginations. Now, the book is full of examples. You could basically think of it as a book full of people who are trying to expand our imaginations about what can be done beyond what most of us know as the possible set of solutions. Let me just mention a couple of examples. So, a lot of you know the show. It's not as popular as it once was, but there's 15 different versions of it over time. And when I talk to my students about shows that they've seen that it's about the legal or criminal justice system, it's still the first one that comes to mind for many. And you probably know the introduction, right? The introduction to every show. In the criminal justice system, the people are represented by two separate yet equally important groups: the police, who investigate crimes, and the district attorneys who prosecute the offenders. These are their stories. Now, as a public defender, of course, that never felt right to me, right? Where were public defenders in this equation? Where were our clients? Where were their families? Where were their children? Are they not part of the public? Are we not part of the public? But, having said that, I also know, as Rachel Barco argues in the essay that we include in the book, I'm also aware of just how powerful prosecutors are. And from what I saw in the 1990s and the 2000s, the years when I was doing most of my practicing, prosecutors invariably use this enormous power in one direction: to lock up more people for longer in worse conditions. And that's one reason why I was so surprised about 10 years ago when I started hearing about a new group of prosecutors who were beginning to challenge that vision of what it meant to be a prosecutor. There was this new group of people that was running against incumbent prosecutors, and they were campaigning on things like charging fewer children as adults, not prosecuting certain types of drug offenses, to rarely or ever seek the death penalty. And I was also surprised when I saw local activists committed to fighting mass incarceration who seized on this potential. They noticed that local district attorney races are important, but a lot of times no one pays attention to them. This meant that if you went out and started educating people and you got them to go out and vote, you could win races that previously had gone uncontested, that everybody had ignored. And the strategy paid off. From Philadelphia to Chicago to Los Angeles, reform-minded candidates won races that no one thought they ever had a chance to win. Now, that success has come with some complications and some contradictions. Here in New Orleans, y'all, how many people know the name of your local prosecutor? Just out of curiosity. Okay, about half. That's good. That number was much less 10 years ago. 10 years ago, it would have been 10% of the people raising their hands. So New Orleans, you have a local prosecutor, Jason Williams. He ran as a progressive, and he clearly has done some things in that direction, right, including reviewing past cases for civil rights violations. The Civil Rights Division that was established in his office freed about 2 people a week in the first year and a half that he was in office. So that's about 350 cases, vacated sentences in about 100, sought sentence reductions in another 200. That's real change, right? At the same time, he has not kept all his promises. He hasn't kept his promise to not prosecute any young people as adults. And he's also facing significant pushback from the state, right, which is trying to undo some of the progress that the Civil Rights Division has made. But even with those limitations, right, even with those contradictions and complications and limitations, the conversation here and around the country about what should the role of the prosecutor be has been forever changed by this group of people that decided to expand their imaginations. And it's not just prosecutors, right? It's also judges. This local movement to elect progressive-minded prosecutors also woke up people to the idea that when judges are elected, people could try to influence who is on their local judiciary. Again, the way you got elected judge was either just you had a lot of money because you were a corporate lawyer, or if you were somebody in the criminal sphere, it was because you had a history of a prosecutor and you ran for judge on that same tough on crime mantra that you would use to run for prosecutor. But right, people started to see, well, let's talk about the power, right, that judges have. Holding probable cause hearings, making bail determinations, presiding over trials, imposing sentences. In some places, like here in New Orleans, also have an influence on sentencing relief. Judges can choose to hold prosecutors accountable for violating their responsibilities to turn over Brady evidence, or they can choose not to, and their decision is going to have a huge impact on how the prosecutors in that community and that jurisdiction choose to operate. So judges have this power, and when they're elected, communities have the right to say, wait a minute, we want somebody that reflects our values. So this is a movement that's called Flip the Bench. It's made inroads in Pennsylvania, Texas, Nevada, right here in New Orleans. I remember a number of years ago, I got a fundraising appeal from a group of people down here, activists, who were raising money about some reform-minded candidates who were running for election in Orleans Parish. And two of them ended up winning. Now, the next frontier, in my view, when we move beyond judges, the next frontier in this effort has to be sheriffs, right? Which is a topic that we don't talk enough about, although I know it's gotten some considerable attention here in New Orleans. And in fact, there's an excerpt in the book that talks about some of that work. But around the country, for too long, we've just taken for granted that sheriffs would be terrible. I mean, that's not a legal word, but that's kind of how it is. But that's changing too. In a lot of communities all around the country, often under the radar groups, community groups are now trying to support candidates for sheriff who have a different vision, who want their jails to be humane places, who want to work to help people find treatment instead of a jail cell, right? Who are eager to make sure that their deputies treat people with dignity and with respect, not with abuse and contempt, as we've seen for so long in this country. Now, in some ways, this effort around sheriffs might be the hardest of all of these fights, because the culture in many of these offices is so resistant to change. But it's worth it. It's worth it. Because sheriffs are too powerful. They have too much influence over the lives of people trapped in the criminal system. They just matter too much for us not to pay attention to the work of electing better ones. All right, especially having ended with sheriffs, this might be the point where some of you are thinking that the work that I'm describing sounds daunting, sounds ambitious. Maybe you all are thinking that I'm too hopeful. Maybe you think I'm underestimating the strength of the opposition, especially here in a state like Louisiana, which boasts the largest per capita prison population of any state in the country, in a country that is one of the world leaders in incarceration. Or maybe, I don't know. I'll find out afterwards, hopefully, when you come up and we can talk individually. Maybe you're thinking something different. Maybe you're thinking that I'm not being ambitious enough, that the ideas that I've mentioned today are too reformist. Let me just say to any of you who have that view, any of you that identify as abolitionists, that even though I have not focused on that material today, that writing is well represented and is part of the conversation in this book. But wherever you land in response to what I'm saying, I hope that my third and final key that I want to share with you will have some resonance. Because for me, as I think about the scale of the challenge, right, that we face, as somebody who's been working in this space for 25 years now, I think it's imperative that we be guided by history in this work. And when I say history, I don't mean history in the general sense. I mean history more specifically. I mean we have to be guided and informed, and I think inspired, by the history of legal and social movements that have come before us. So let me just share a couple of examples of what I mean. So I went to law school, as you can see from my gray hair, I went to law school some time ago. And when I went without I didn't have a clear plan of the kind of lawyer that I wanted to be. But I knew I wanted to do civil rights work. That's the one thing that I knew. And Thurgood Marshall and Charles Hamilton Houston and Constance Baker Motley, the other lawyers who helped to break down segregation and Jim Crow, they were my heroes. But I didn't know what that meant for my generation. So when I was in law school, I was very eager when a young lawyer who had recently moved from Atlanta, Georgia to Montgomery, Alabama to do death penalty work, he came to give a lecture on the death penalty. And his name was Bryan Stevenson. Now, at the time, Stevenson was like lawyer famous. He wasn't Hollywood famous. He wasn't Oprah famous. There was no Michael B. Jordan playing him in a movie. But he came to tell us that the death penalty was the civil rights issue of our generation. And he talked about the case that many decades later would be the basis of the film, Just Mercy, and of the book, Just Mercy, that I hope some of you all have read and seen. And Stevenson was eloquent and brilliant and inspiring, as he always is. I don't think he can order lunch without being inspiring. But having said that, he was also clear-eyed about the scale of the challenge. Because he came to speak at Yale Law School in 1991. Now, some of you all that are on the professor side of things, or maybe a student who is coming to law school a little bit later in life, some remember that era. Those of you who are younger don't. But let me tell you about it. Because it was a time when politicians tripped over one another to see who could be harsher, who could demand more executions, who could fight to lock up more people for longer periods of time. They called at the time openly and publicly for children and for people with mental disabilities to be executed. Bill Clinton, who I like in many ways, but Bill Clinton, to his everlasting shame, took a break from the campaign trail when he was running for president to personally oversee the execution of an Arkansas man with an IQ of 61. Just to win an election by showing the nation that he too could be tough on crime. So this is the era. This is the vibe. And at the time that Stephen stood before us at this lectern, the United States was on its way to a terrible record. It was on its way to a record for the most death sentences that were imposed in a single year in the modern era. In 1996, all across the United States, 315 people were sentenced to death. I don't mean on death row, I mean were given death sentences. Many, many more were on death row from having received death sentences in previous years. Now, against this tide of public opinion and the numbers that were going against him, right? People like Bryan Stevenson, What did he do? People like Steve Bright in Atlanta, people like Clive Stafford Smith, who moved from England to Atlanta and then here to Louisiana. What did they and many others do in response? Right? They didn't quit. They fought. They tenaciously and passionately and courageously took a stand, made the case against the death penalty. They enlisted lawyers and teachers and educators, journalists and politicians, family members of people who had been incarcerated, and family members of victims of crime who didn't believe in executions, clergy, scientists, and students. And slowly, methodically, over time, they started to have an impact. They started to succeed. Their fight has led to a 90% decline in the number of death sentences imposed in this country, from 315 imposed at the height in 1996, just a few years before Brian Stevenson came to speak to us at law school. Last year, from 315, there were 21. Now, that's 21 for me. I don't believe in the death penalty, so I think that's 21 too many. There are too many people on death row, and there are too many people who are serving life sentences that effectively function and feel to many like death sentences. But despite that, there is no way that we can ignore a 90% reduction, right, in the number of death sentences imposed. That's 300 people, 300 families who are saved from the worst penalty and the worst punishment that our law and our legal system has to offer. Now, I've been talking about the 90s. And the death penalty is only one of the human rights and racial justice and civil rights issues of that era. Because at the time that people were asking for more death sentences, they were also demanding that we lock up more and more young people at younger and younger ages for longer, and that we keep them behind bars for longer and longer. Crime was rising in this era, so the concerns about safety were not made up. They were not fabricated. Communities did feel under threat. It was a difficult time in Washington, in Atlanta, where I grew up, in D.C., where I lived for many years, in New Orleans. But instead of trying to understand what drove children to violence, to delinquency, instead of addressing the substandard schools, the decrepit housing, the rampant poverty, the parks that were too dirty and too shabby for any parent to leave their child in after school, right? Instead of any of that, the country blamed the kids. They said things like, we're facing a new generation of super predators, more violent, more deadly. This is a quote, less caring, less remorseful than any generation that has come before. And all across the country, what do? We sent more and more young people to youth prisons. We hid those prisons, those youth prisons, we hid them behind pleasant-sounding names like camp or youth center or children's center, when really many of them deserve to be called dungeons. So as you can see here, roughly that same period of time when we have the rise in the death penalty, this country hits the peak in 2000. So we hit the peak in number of executions in 96. In 2000, 4 years later, we would hit the peak in juvenile incarceration rates. So even then, at the worst of times, right, people organized to resist. They said, well, we cannot do this to our young people. They said, we cannot keep abandoning them. We have to find better approaches that are going to help guide them to make better choices and help their communities. We're going to do things like start a school in D.C. called Maya Angelou, or another school in New Orleans called Travis Hill, which you heard Professor Snowden talk about. Right? So at the time that they are making this case, none of this is easy. Politicians were saying, and I remember it, they said to us, if you reduce juvenile incarceration, crime will go up. But in the face of that, people persisted. What happened? Stunning progress. Decline in juvenile incarceration rates. Since 2000, every year has seen a decline across the country in the number of young people locked up. Red states and blue states lock up many fewer people than in 2000. In most states, the declines have been massive. 29 states have seen a 75% decrease in their juvenile incarceration rates. And with fewer kids behind bars, many states have shuttered some of their largest and their worst youth prisons. So this youth facilities in this country that are designated as large are more than 100 young people in them. And in 2000, there were 264 such facilities in the country. Now, these places are often, not always, but they are often the worst of the worst. So this was in 2000. Now, 20 years later, because of this advocacy, because of this activism, because of people building alternative programs, because of people persuading legislators, in 2000, that 264 had declined to 44. Now, for me, that's still 44 too many. I don't think we should have any youth facilities that are this large. The few that we have, I think, should be yet smaller. The few that we might need to have, I think, should be smaller. But we shouldn't overlook the scale of this progress, and we shouldn't ask ourselves questions then about how it was created, how it was achieved, and how we can take the things that have been successful in the death penalty, the things that have been successful in juvenile incarceration, and apply them to other issues that we all care about. So when I look at a problem that seems insurmountable today, I imagine people like Brian Stevenson looking at the death penalty in the early 1990s, right? Looking at what looked like would be a never-ending rise in the number of death sentences imposed. Or youth justice advocates looking at what would look like it would be a never-ending rise in the number of young people incarcerated in this country. And I try to remind myself that no challenge that I face today is greater than that, is greater than theirs. So I want to wrap up with one more example or one more story about learning from our history. It was this story, it grows out of a conversation that I had with my father. And we had watched a film. It was a few years before he passed away. In the 2000s, we watched a film about the civil rights movement. And when the film was over, I asked my dad, what did he think about it? This is my dad with Dr. King. I said, you know, look, Dad, what did you make of this movie? Because you were there, I wasn't. And he said, look, I liked the fact that they've made a movie about this history. Because he said more people watch movies than read books. I can tell you now as an author that he was correct about that. He said, but there is something that I didn't like. He said, what I really didn't like is the way they made it seem like the civil rights movement was popular. The way they made it seem like everybody was in it. The way they made it seem like everyone was marching. He said, it wasn't like that. He said, you know, we used to go recruit on campuses to try to recruit people to join the movement. And the administrators would run us off campus. Now, those same universities that didn't want to let them on campus decades later, you'll find in the hallways portraits where they promote the role of their alumni who were involved in the civil rights movement. My dad said, look, Dr. King was unpopular when he died. It's true. Gallup. Dr. King had a 2/3 unfavorable rating 3 months before he was killed in a Gallup poll. My dad said the March on Washington was unpopular when it happened. Y'all know the March on, if there's one thing, I know now because my kid's in school, so I know, like, this is what the civil rights, history of the civil rights movement has been boiled down to. Dr. King at the March on Washington. Well, the March on Washington was not popular. Roper, which was another polling organization, now gone out of business, but it used to be big. They did a poll. They asked people 2 months before the march, do you think that the planned demonstration in Washington, D.C. will help or hurt the cause of the Negro? That was the question. 60% of the people said they thought it would hurt. Well, there were 250,000 people at the March on Washington. And that's a lot. But a decade later, 10 million people would say they were there. So what's going on? My dad said, I'm not telling you this story because I want credit for being there first. That's not the point. He said, I'm telling you this story because I think the way that as a nation and media and culture tell the history of the civil rights movement is demoralizing to your generation. Because you have a meeting to call an issue, you have a meeting to work on something of your generation. And there's 10 people at the meeting, and 6 of them were involved in organizing it. And you think, well, what's wrong with my cause? There was millions of people in Selma. What's wrong with us? So my dad said, this is the thing that I want you to remember. I never want you to believe that the size of the crowd is a measure of the righteousness of the cause. He said, because here's what's going to happen. When you have an idea and you want to fight for change against something that is established and entrenched and always been there, people are going to tell you that changing it is impossible. If you ignore them and you choose the strategy for yourself, you march, you litigate, you educate, you legislate, you advocate, but you ignore them, and you create the change that they told you was impossible, those same people are going to turn around and say, oh, yeah, that was inevitable. And then they're going to make a movie about it. So I don't know what is the issue or what is the moment or who is the group of people in this room that is going to come together to galvanize change. But I know you're here. SNCC was started on a college campus. So I know the idea is in the room, and I know that it is bigger and bolder and more breathtaking than anything that I have talked about or that we have put in this book. So I know the idea is here, and I know that the people are here. And I know that if you ignore all of those who say that it cannot be done, that if you come together in community and you fight for change, I know that one day they're going to make a movie about you. And when they do, Dean Landrew, Professor Tachinda, when they do, please invite me back, not to stand here, but to sit in the audience and watch your film and stand and applaud and cheer and thank you for the change that you have created for this country. Thank you very much. Thank you. Are we doing Q&A or are we doing reception? You tell me. Whatever your ground rules are, I'm following.
Actually, whatever you prefer, but there's a lovely reception outside with books.
I'm never standing in the way of the reception.
Well, there are a few questions. Maybe we can do
Two questions. Two questions. Who's done?
One thing that I did not hear you mention, I am a decarceration expert and a prison traumatologist,
Okay.
okay?
A prison traumatologist.
Prison traumatologist.
Can you tell me what that is?
A prison traumatologist is a person that has devoted her entire life on prison trauma.
Ah, thank you. Thank you for
So,
that.
one of the things that I'm really challenged with here, with the mass incarceration, is the fact that in none of the presentations that I'm hearing, I'm not hearing the human aspects of the effects of the incarceration, whether it be mass or not. Inside your lecture, you said that the person spent 42 days in prison. And I'm thinking to myself, it's like 42 days in prison, you said it wasn't a long time. But for a person that has
Yes.
spent time in prison, like myself, of 12 and a half years,
Yes.
those 42 days probably felt like those 12 and a half.
Yes.
And so what I am posing is this. Okay, Washington University is the one that gave me this idea because they sent for me about 2 weeks ago. And I went up there and I was talking to the professors because I didn't realize that a lot of universities now have decarceration departments. I was not aware of that. And so they were doing their research and they came across my decarceration, which means to help individuals reverse the effects of incarceration as a result of prison trauma. So my whole focus is the prison trauma. The other thing that I'm learning with the mass incarceration, now we need you guys to do your thing. We need you to keep doing your thing. But it would be a wonderful thing if we could collaborate. Because you see, I have lived experience.
Yes.
The majority of my time I spent in that solitary confinement. So my prison trauma is extremely real, okay? And so what happens is this. If we could combine our efforts, because you want to get us out of prison, but to what?
Yeah.
To what? We're coming out here, we're still faced with the same challenges that we had before we went into prison. And while you guys are doing an amazing job, a great job, but what happens to us while we're in prison, no one is addressing. It has nothing to do with our sentence. While I was in prison and I had a 25-year sentence, Mr. Forman, no one sentenced me to go get my teeth knocked out, shoulder knocked out of place, fractured rib, beaten and maced and kicked and spit on, and that wasn't part of my sentence.
Right.
Why did I have to go through all that? So those are the things that this whole decarceration concept has to start addressing. Orleans Parish Prison, Sheriff Hudson is doing something that no one else in this entire country is doing. She has allowed me to, well actually they won a $1 million grant from the Department of Justice for me to pilot this decarceration program at the prison. And so now we are establishing the first decarceration honor dorm inside of a facility. And so all the participants that have graduated from my decarceration program, they go on to this dorm where they will teach and facilitate, and they coach, they become trainers and mediators and facilitators for the entire facility. So where you guys are approaching decarceration from the outside in, people like myself with the lived experience, we are collaborating to address the same decarceration from the inside out. And so if we don't do them together, your efforts is not, it's going to be futile.
Yeah.
My efforts are going to be futile because once they make this transformation in prison, without you, we can't show the world our transformation because we're stuck in prison with a life sentence. So that's why your efforts are important. But I can see your direction you're going, but you don't have a clue about who I am or what I do. I have an episode of Netflix, and I could go on and on and on with my kudos. But you don't have a clue about me because that's not part of your decarceration concept. And so my appeal to you, I was invited here by the National Council of Jewish Women because they wanted me to come and make sure that I ask you and share with you. There's a whole part of this decarceration concept that all of you are missing. And I really appeal to you for the 3 million of my peers that are incarcerated. Add us to this solution. Add us to this platform. Add us to your decarceration concept and let us work together. You can't do what I do. I work in the prison every day, not because I'm a contractor, it's my job. It is my passion. Those are my peers. I speak their language. I know the pain that they're going through. I know the way they miss their families. Those that have committed murder, where is their therapy? They tell us to go to social workers and counselors. But Mr. Forman, not one of your students at this university has ever had a prison trauma training class. The university doesn't even allow it, doesn't even have it. So if you guys are not being trained for prison trauma training, how are you going to teach me? How are you going to help me? How many times as a public defender did you ever use prison trauma as a defense? A lot of times my people are born into an environment of incarceration. We grow up in an environment of incarceration. The youngest person in my class went to prison when he was 11 years old. He's 61, now they gave him life. His entire life has been incarcerated. Did he fail, or did we, the system, fail him? We failed him. So that's all I have to say.
No, well, that's not all you have to say. I know you have that, but so I really appreciate that, and I'm so glad that we didn't not have like a question, because your question to me and your comment, your statement, really more than a question, I think is one of the most important things that has been said in this space tonight, and so I'm glad you said it. There's a few things in particular that I just want to respond to. First of all, I'm really glad you made the point about the thing about the 42 days. It's so funny that you said, it's not funny, but as a speaker, at that moment when I said that word, I was like, no, that's not right. Okay, so let me try to stop and give some context and explain what I'm trying to say, because of course, every day, every hour is a long time. 42 days is a long time. What I'm trying to say is that in this conversation that people are having, when they talk about, like the mayor, when he talks about, oh, I'm not a right-wing tough on crime person. I'm not saying that they should have juvenile life. I'm talking about, a short period of time. I was trying to point out that even that number of days that some people would call short really isn't. But of course, that's not what I said. And so I'm glad that you corrected me on that and raised it up for the room, because that's exactly right. And the moment it came out of my mouth, I was like, that's not right. And I'm glad you pointed that out, because I wouldn't want anybody else to leave under that, the misimpression that my comments by themselves would have left the audience with. So I want to thank you for that. The other thing that you said that I mean, so many things that you said that are important, but one of the things that I think is sort of part of what you're saying when you talk about that honor dorm, right? And I don't know the particular program in New Orleans, but I do know other programs in a couple of other states that are run by formerly incarcerated or currently incarcerated people that have maybe some of those same virtues. And what I think, what the people that I've talked to who have created those spaces would say, and I think you would agree with me, is that what the prisons are allowing to be the honor dorm, like the conditions there, though that's what everybody should have, and even better. So it shouldn't be reserved for a number of people who have graduated from a particular program or have been selected into a particular opportunity. To me, it's like a starting point. Like you're establishing through your work an image or a model of what could be, and then you're saying there's no place in the jail or there's no place in the prison that shouldn't be this way. And then the last thing that I'll say, because to me where the decarceration work ties into exactly what you're saying is, I believe we want to have as few to no people in prison at all, and then those that are there, we want to be in conditions like what you described, right? We do not want them to be treated the way you were treated and the way so many people, virtually everybody is treated. Certainly my students like New York and the other students who are incarcerated who I've taught, who tell me the same thing about their treatment. So I think what you're saying is that we need both of these things at the same time. We need to massively shrink the number of people that are inside, and then we need to treat those that are remaining with levels of dignity and levels of respect and levels of care and levels of compassion and levels of fellow humanity like what you're describing.
Can I show you an example? I'm a visionary.
Yes, and then after that, can I just say, after that, can you and I continue the conversation outside after you do that?
Sir, who are you?
My name's Garrett.
That's your name? Who are you?
I'm an honorable man. I am somebody. I love myself. Through decarceration, I learned so that I can be the best version of myself.
He's a graduate of the decarceration. You gave me your name, but that didn't tell me who you was as a person. So the decarceration is just what you guys are saying it is. But it's like, you know how one word could have several meanings? This is not a program that's like all the other formerly incarcerated people's program. No, sir, it is not. If you incarcerate a person, you can't incarcerate them without decarcerating them. If you dehumanize, demoralize, desensitize, desocialize, demarginalize, then dehumanize them, where do they go to get that back? So while they are incarcerated, this decarceration process helps them to decarcerate, not to re-enter back to prison, but to de-entry,
Right,
where they never come back, which supports your work of getting us out in the first place. So while we're there, what we need you guys to do when you're fighting for the advocacy and the policies and all those things is demand that we are allowed decarceration training while we're there.
right.
That's what I'm asking for the lawmakers to help us do.
Okay.
We got the training part while we're there, but we need your voices to help us to get DOC and the sheriffs and the locals to allow us to have our own people to train us in how to be honorable men and women, because we don't know. That was it.
Thank you. Thank you.
Our time is up, but you're welcome to speak to Professor Forman in person, and please enjoy the reception and the book signing. Take care. Thanks for coming.